Hey guys, tonight we are diving headfirst, probably without a helmet, into the bustling, bewildering, and frankly, quite whiffy world of ancient Rome. Imagine, if you will, that you've just woken up, not in your comfy bed, not with your phone on the nightstand, but on a rough straw pallet in a city that's about 2,000 years past its sell-by date for modern sensibilities. You are about to experience a day in the life, and let me tell you, it's not all togas and philosophical ponderings. You probably won't survive this. I mean, a full 24 hours. With the sanitation, the food, the distinct lack of Wi-Fi. It's a long shot, bless your cotton socks. But hey, that's why we're here, to explore it from a safe, cozy distance. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. It really does help the channel out, and lets me know you're enjoying these little historical jaunts. And while you're at it, I'd love to know where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. Drop a comment below. It's always fascinating to see our little community spread across the globe. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Alright, so there you are. It's early. You know this not because of a gently chiming alarm or the soft glow of your phone screen, but because the sliver of gray light filtering through a tiny unglazed window, slit high up in the wall, has shifted from pitch black to murky. The air is cool, carrying with it a delightful bouquet of smells you can't quite place, but stale, damp, and faintly of mouse are definitely in the mix. You're lying on something that feels suspiciously like a sack filled with dried grass, and it's doing absolutely nothing for your back. You instinctively reach for your phone. Nope, just more rough fabric. That slight panic begins to set in. No soothing scroll through social media to ease you into the day. No checking the news. Just this dim, slightly chilly room. Your first conscious thought after, "Where on earth am I?" is probably, "I need the bathroom." And this, my friend, is where your Roman adventure truly begins to test your modern mettle. There's no ensuite here. If you're lucky, and by lucky I mean not in the absolute cheapest tenement, there might be a chamber pot in the corner. A simple clay pot? No lid, no flush, no air freshener. You use it, and then, you'll have to carry it down several flights of rickety wooden stairs later to empty it into a larger communal cesspit. Or, if you're feeling particularly brazen, and it's still dark enough, straight out the window onto the street below. Yes, really. Historians still ponder the exact daily logistics of waste disposal for the millions living in Rome's apartment blocks, or insulae. But let's just say, upstairs Downpipe Street was a depressingly common, if illegal, method. It gave a whole new meaning to watch your step. Let's assume you navigate the chamber pot situation. Next, hygiene. You splash some cold water on your face from a clay jug. It's invigorating and slightly gritty. Soap? A delightful luxury mostly unknown to the average Roman. They did clean themselves, often at the public baths later in the day, using olive oil and a curved metal scraper called a strigil. But for now, it's a quick splash and a promise to yourself that you'll deal with the full body situation later. Maybe, if you survive that long. And then, the craving hits. That deep, primal need for caffeine. A lovely steaming cup of coffee. or perhaps a comforting mug of tea. You look around, hopeful. You see more clay pots, maybe a small sputtering oil lamp if it was left burning. No kettle, no coffee maker, no Nespresso machine with its comforting whir. The Romans, bless their forward thinking in aqueducts and concrete, completely missed the boat on coffee and tea. They simply didn't exist in their world. Your morning pick-me-up might be some water, or if you're feeling a bit fancy, some watered-down wine left over from last night. Yes, wine for breakfast. It sounds decadent, but when the water quality is questionable, slightly alcoholic beverages were often a safer bet. Or perhaps you'd have some pasca, a rather vinegary drink made from watered-down wine and herbs, popular with soldiers in the lower classes. It's an acquired taste. Imagine a very, very sad kombucha. The room itself is tiny. 4 rough-hewn walls, probably made of cheap timber and wattle and daub, or poorly constructed brick if you're on a lower, slightly more premium floor of this ancient apartment building, known as an insula. These insula were notorious for being fire traps and prone to collapse. Think of them as the ancient world's equivalent of those impossibly Jenga-like buildings you see in disaster movies, but with more rats. A mainstream historical fact for you. The poet Juvenal wrote scathingly about the dangers of living in Rome, lamenting the constant threat of fire and falling roof tiles. He wasn't exaggerating for comedic effect. Much, you're probably feeling a bit disoriented, a bit grubby, and definitely uncaffeinated. Your clothes, by the way, are likely a simple tunic. Itchy, woolen, and probably the only outfit you own that isn't currently being laundered by being steeped in urine at the local Fuller's. Oh yes, that's a quirky little tidbit. Stale urine, rich in ammonia, was a key ingredient in Roman laundry, and even for some brave souls, as a teeth-whitening mouthwash. You can imagine the delightful aroma wafting from the Fulleries. Perhaps that's one of the notes in the morning air you couldn't quite identify. Suddenly, that sad vinegary pasca doesn't sound so bad, does it? It's certainly better than gargling week-old pee. The scholarly debate about private sanitation in these insulae rages on. While some larger ground floor dwellings might have had rudimentary latrines connected to sewers, the vast majority of tenants, especially on the upper floors, relied on chamber pots and those public cesspits. The logistics of carrying slops down multiple flights of stairs, daily, for thousands of people in a single block. It's mind-boggling and stomach-churning. It's a wonder the streets weren't permanently ankle-deep in. Well, you get the picture. So you're awake. Ish. You've dealt with the immediate biological necessities in a way that would make a modern health inspector weep. You've splashed your face with water that might give you a mild case of dysentery if you're unlucky. And your dreams of a morning latte have been cruelly dashed against the rocks of historical reality. The day hasn't even properly started, and you're already questioning all your life choices that led you to this imaginary ancient Roman morning. The gentle humor in all this, of course, is that we get to experience it with a comfortable detachment. You, however, in this scenario, are living it. And the biggest joke? Your Roman neighbors would think this is all perfectly normal. They'd probably wonder why you look so green around the gills. First time in the city, eh? They might chuckle before spitting a glob of something unidentifiable onto the floor. Welcome to Rome. Now, about that breakfast. Okay, you've managed to make it through the initial shock of waking up in a world without alarms, decent plumbing, or the blessed bean. Your stomach is starting to rumble, a hollow protest against the lack of its customary morning fuel. So, what's on the menu for Ientaculum, the Roman breakfast? You follow the slightly less stale air, hoping it leads to something edible. Perhaps you stumble out of your tiny room into a slightly larger common area, or maybe your host, if you have one, is already up and about. Don't expect a cheery, "Good morning, sleep well?" More likely a grunt and a gesture towards a rough wooden table. On this table, you might find a hunk of bread. This isn't your artisanal sourdough or your fluffy white sliced loaf. This is Roman bread. Likely made from emmer wheat or barley, it's dense, probably a bit coarse, and depending on the miller's diligence, might contain a surprising amount of grit. Dental health in ancient Rome wasn't exactly stellar, and the constant grinding of stone on stone in the milling process meant tiny particles often ended up in the flour. Think of it as exfoliation for your teeth. From the inside, you might get a small bowl of olive oil to dip it in, or if you're truly splashing out, some watered-down wine. Again with the wine. It was a staple, used almost like water, though usually diluted. If you're a bit more fortunate, there might be a piece of cheese. Probably a hard, salty sheep's or goat's cheese. Think pecorino, but perhaps a bit rougher around the edges. Forget your creamy brie or your delicate camembert. This is survival cheese, meant to last. Maybe some fruit, if it's in season, a few figs, some grapes, perhaps an apple. But don't picture a vibrant fruit bowl from a Dutch master painting. Picture a slightly bruised apple that's seen better days. For many poorer Romans, breakfast, if eaten at all, was incredibly simple. Often just leftovers from the previous night's meal. A bit of cold porridge, perhaps? And here's a mainstream historical fact. Pulse, a kind of porridge or pottage made from boiled grains like emmer wheat or spelt, was a foundational food for many Romans, especially in the earlier periods of the Republic and for the lower classes and soldiers throughout Roman history. It could be made savory with salt and cheese, or sometimes sweetened with honey if you were lucky. It's the kind of basic, filling fare that keeps you going, but isn't going to win any culinary awards. Imagine a very, very bland oatmeal, and your modern palate, accustomed to sugar-frosted flakes or avocado toast, would likely find it underwhelming, to put it mildly. Is this it? You might think, looking at the meager spread. Yes, this is very likely it. You eye the water jug with suspicion, remembering the grit from your morning face wash. Is it safe? Well, Rome was famous for its aqueducts, bringing millions of liters of water into the city daily. But that water was then distributed through lead pipes, and often stored in less than sanitary cisterns. While the continuously flowing public fountains were probably safer, the water that made its way into individual dwellings, especially cheap insula, might have been questionable. Scholars still debate the full extent of lead poisoning in the Roman population and its potential societal impacts. But it's safe to say you wouldn't be chugging that water with the same abandon you would tap water back home. Maybe that's another reason for the watered-down wine at breakfast. A little alcohol to kill the little beasties. One can hope, anyway. And then there's the speed of it all. This isn't a leisurely affair, with newspapers and quiet contemplation. For many Romans, particularly laborers or those who needed to attend the morning salutatio, we'll get to that delightful social ritual later. Breakfast was eaten quickly, often standing up or even on the go. They'd grab their piece of bread and be off. The whole concept of a breakfast rush takes on a new meaning when you're literally rushing to secure your daily bread from a patron. Now for a quirky, lesser-known tidbit about Roman food, though perhaps not strictly for breakfast, unless you were particularly decadent and a bit peculiar. Romans, especially the wealthy, considered roasted dormice a delicacy. Yes, dormice. Those cute little sleepy rodents. They would be fattened up in special terracotta jars called gliraria, then stuffed with minced pork and nuts, and roasted or fried. Pliny the Elder mentions them, and Apicius, the famous Roman gourmand, includes recipes. You probably wouldn't find this on your average plebeian breakfast table, thank goodness. But it does give you a sense of the adventurous Roman palate. You're probably looking at your piece of gritty bread now with a newfound appreciation, aren't you? Could be worse, you mutter. Could be a fattened mouse. Small victories. There's an ongoing scholarly debate about how widespread the practice of eating breakfast actually was, and how its importance might have varied across social classes and over the centuries of Roman history. Some sources suggest it was a very light meal or even skipped entirely by some, with the main meal, cena, being taken in the late afternoon. For the working poor, however, some form of sustenance to start a day of hard labor seems likely, even if it was just a crust of bread. It's a bit like trying to figure out if everyone really eats breakfast today, or if some people just grab a coffee and call it good. The evidence is patchy, drawn from mosaics, letters, and archaeological finds. So you chew your slightly sandy bread, sip your watery wine or slightly suspect water, and try to summon some enthusiasm for the day ahead. Your stomach is no longer entirely empty, but it's far from satisfied. You're missing the sugar, the protein kick, the sheer variety you're accustomed to. You might find yourself idly wondering if there's a Roman equivalent of a brunch spot, somewhere you can get a decent omelet and a strong coffee. Spoiler alert, there isn't. You're also probably becoming acutely aware of the general lack of, well, refined sugar. Honey was the primary sweetener and it was used, but not with the abandon we see in modern diets. Those pastries, donuts, and sweetened cereals you take for an energy boost? Non-existent. This Roman diet, at least for the average person, was fairly utilitarian. As you finish your repast, a generous term perhaps, you might notice your Roman companions are already getting antsy. There are things to do, places to be. The city outside is stirring, and it waits for no one, especially not for someone wistfully dreaming of a blueberry muffin. You steel yourself. You've survived the wake-up. You've choked down the breakfast. What's next? Oh, just navigating the streets of the largest, most chaotic city in the ancient world. Easy peasy. Right? You give a weak smile. The day is young, and your chances of making it to dinner are, in your humble opinion, still hovering around the iffy mark. One thing's for sure, you're definitely not asking for seconds of that gritty bread. All right. You've had your, shall we say, minimalist Roman breakfast. Your stomach is more confused than full, and your caffeine headache is starting to play a little ditty behind your eyeballs. But there's no time to dwell on your culinary disappointments, because now it's time to venture out. You step out of the relatively dim interior of your insula apartment, or perhaps the slightly more spacious ground floor dwelling, if you're a bit luckier, and into the vibrant, chaotic, and frankly overwhelmingly smelly streets of Rome. The first thing that hits you is the noise. It's a cacophony, a relentless barrage of sounds that your modern ears accustomed to the dull roar of city traffic filtered through double glazing, are simply unprepared for. Hawkers are shouting their wares from every doorway and makeshift stall. Fresh figs! Get your lovely fresh figs here. Hot sausages? Best in the Sabura. Knives sharpened, cheap. Dogs are barking, donkeys are braying, children are shrieking as they play some kind of ancient Roman tag amidst the throng. You hear the rhythmic clang of a blacksmith's hammer from a nearby workshop, the chatter of 100 conversations in rapid-fire Latin, the shuffling and slapping of sandals on stone. It's an assault on the senses, and you haven't even taken 10 steps yet. Then there's the smell. Oh, the glorious, unforgettable aroma of ancient Rome. It's a complex blend, a rich tapestry woven from unwashed bodies, animal dung. Because yes, animals were everywhere. Mules, goats, dogs, even the occasional escaped chicken. Overflowing cesspits that haven't been emptied recently enough. Cooking food from 1,000 little street kitchens. Some of it smelling quite good, actually. A tantalizing hint of roasting meat or baking bread. Others, less so. Perhaps some fermented fish sauce. Garum, that's a bit too ripe for your liking. And don't forget the delightful fumes from various industrial processes. The acrid tang from tanneries, and, as we've touched upon, the ammonia-rich bouquet from the fulleries, where clothes were cleaned using urine. You try to breathe shallowly, but it's pervasive, inescapable. It clings to the back of your throat. You suddenly understand why wealthy Romans carried pomanders filled with fragrant herbs. The streets themselves are narrow, many of them anyway, especially in the older, more crowded districts like the Sabura. They twist and turn, a labyrinth of cobblestones and packed earth. There are no neat sidewalks, no pedestrian crossings with little green men telling you when it's safe. It's a free-for-all. You're jostling shoulder to shoulder with a river of humanity. People are everywhere, hurrying, loitering, arguing, laughing. A mainstream historical fact for you. At its height, the city of Rome had a population estimated at around 1 million people, packed into a relatively small area. It was one of the most densely populated cities in the world before the Industrial Revolution, and that density is palpable as you try to push your way through the crowd. You have to watch where you're going, and not just because of the people. The paving stones, where they exist, are often uneven, cracked, or missing entirely, creating convenient ankle-twisting traps for the unwary. And remember those chamber pots from earlier. You need to keep an eye on the windows above you. While there were laws against throwing waste from windows, the Lex Aquilia covered damage to property, which could include drenching an unfortunate passerby. They weren't always effective. A sudden shout of "cave! Look out!" might be your only warning before a cascade of something unpleasant rains down from an upper story. You develop a nervous habit of glancing upwards. Wheeled traffic, like heavy supply carts, was largely banned from the city center during daylight hours. This was a measure introduced by Julius Caesar and maintained by later emperors, designed to alleviate congestion. It's a point of contention among experts just how strictly this was enforced and what the exact hours were. But generally, the daytime streets were for pedestrians and litters. Ah, the litters. These are portable couches, or enclosed sedan chairs, carried by sturdy slaves, on which the wealthy reclined as they were transported above the muck and mire of the streets. You see several of these gliding through the crowd, their occupants looking serene and detached, perhaps fanning themselves or reading a scroll, oblivious to the chaos they're creating as people scramble to get out of their way. You, of course, are one of the scramblers. Here's a quirky little tidbit about Roman street design. In many streets, particularly those prone to getting muddy or flooded with sewage, you'd find large, raised stepping stones placed at intervals across the road. These allowed pedestrians to cross from one side to the other without getting their feet too filthy. Cleverly, the stones were often spaced just right so that the wheels of carts, when they were allowed, could pass between them. So you might find yourself hopping from stone to stone, like a rather undignified game of hopscotch, to avoid a particularly nasty-looking puddle of indeterminate origin. You quickly realize that navigating these streets requires a whole new set of skills. You need to be constantly alert, aware of who and what is around you. Pickpockets and petty thieves were rife, blending into the crowds, looking for an easy target. Someone bumps into you. Was it an accident? Or are they checking your, presumably empty in this scenario, pockets? There are no friendly police officers on every corner to ask for directions. In fact, while Rome did have the Vigiles Urbani, who acted as a sort of police force and fire brigade, their presence wouldn't have been as pervasive or as focused on minor street crime as a modern police force. You are, to a large extent, on your own. You see people from all walks of life, stern-faced senators in their crisp white togas, though probably not too many in the real crush of the lower-class districts. Merchants haggling loudly, soldiers on leave swaggering with an air of importance, women balancing baskets on their heads, slaves scurrying on errands for their masters, their faces often set in a look of weary resignation. It's a bewildering, exhausting, and strangely exhilarating experience. You feel 1,000,000 miles and 2 millennia away from the orderly, sanitized, and often isolating experience of modern urban life. Here, life is lived out loud in public, with all its smells, noises, and inconveniences. You're probably starting to feel a bit grubby yourself. The dust from the street is coating your tunic. You've narrowly avoided stepping in something truly awful at least twice, and the sheer effort of pushing through the crowds is making you sweat. And still, that caffeine headache is throbbing. You think wistfully of a quiet cafe, a clean pavement, a moment of peace. Rome, however, has other plans for you. The day is just getting started, and if you think the streets are bad, wait until you see your likely living conditions if you haven't already had the full tour. Or better yet, what happens if you need to find a public restroom? That's an experience all on its own. For now, you just focus on putting one foot in front of the other, trying not to get trampled, and hoping you're generally heading in a direction that doesn't smell too strongly of stale urine. Good luck with that last one. You've braved the Roman streets, a trial by odor and obstacle, and now perhaps you're retreating to what passes for home in this ancient metropolis. Or maybe you've just woken up and this is your first proper horrified assessment of your lodgings. Either way, prepare for a dose of domestic reality that will make your modern apartment, however small or messy, feel like a palace. Welcome to your typical Roman apartment building, the Insula, literally island, a name that perhaps hints at how it stands, often precariously, amidst the sea of the city. Forget spacious living. Your Insula apartment, if you're one of the teeming masses, is likely to be a single small dimly lit room, perhaps two, if you're relatively well off, for a plebeian. These buildings were often several stories high, 5, 6, sometimes even more, pushing the limits of ancient construction techniques and safety regulations, which were, shall we say, rather lax by modern standards. The ground floor often housed shops or workshops, tabernae, opening onto the street, or sometimes more spacious, desirable apartments for those who could afford them. But you're probably on an upper floor. The higher you go, the cheaper and more dangerous the accommodation. The construction itself is a major concern. Many insulae were built by speculative landlords out to make a quick denarius, using shoddy materials and cutting corners wherever possible. Walls might be made of cheap timber frames filled with rubble and plaster, opus criticium, or poorly fired bricks. They were, to put it mildly, not built to last. Collapses were alarmingly common. Imagine dozing off, only to be awakened by the groan of stressed timbers and the terrifying realization that your entire building is about to pancake. The historian Suetonius mentions that Emperor Augustus had to set a height limit of 70 Roman feet, about 20 to 21 meters, for these buildings, precisely because of the frequent collapses. It's a sobering thought that your ceiling might, at any given moment, decide to become your new floor. Then there's the ever-present threat of fire. This is a huge one, with open braziers for heating and cooking, if you were even allowed them on upper floors, as they were a massive fire risk, flickering oil lamps for light, and buildings constructed largely of wood and other flammable materials packed closely together. Fires were an absolute scourge of Rome. A small cooking mishap in one apartment could quickly engulf an entire block, or even an entire district. There's a reason Rome had the vigils? A corps of watchmen who acted as both firefighters and a rudimentary police force. This mainstream historical fact underscores the very real and constant danger. They had pumps and buckets, but fighting a blaze in a 6-story tinderbox was a monumental and often futile task. You'd sleep with one ear open, listening for the crackle of flames or the panicked shouts of fire. Inside your cramped room, comforts are few. There's no running water. If you need water, you haul it up yourself in buckets from a public fountain, which might be several streets away and involve queuing. There's no central heating, obviously. In winter, you shiver. You might have a small smoky brazier if you dare, but you're constantly aware of the fumes and the fire risk. In summer, it's stiflingly hot, with only a small, unglazed window opening. If you're lucky enough to have one that doesn't just open onto a dingy internal courtyard for ventilation. This window would have wooden shutters, but no glass, so it's either open to the elements and the noise and the smells and the insects, or closed, plunging you into near darkness. Privacy? What's that? Walls are thin. You can probably hear every argument, every cough, every intimate moment from your neighbors, and they can hear yours. If you have a family, you're all crammed into this one small space. Children sleep on the floor or share the rough bed. There's little room for personal possessions, little space to yourself. It's a life lived cheek by jowl with your fellow Romans. And let's talk about sanitation again, because it's inescapable. We've mentioned the chamber pots. If your insula is particularly squalid, there might not even be a communal latrine on the ground floor. It's just pots and the street, or perhaps a public latrine some distance away. The smell even inside can be challenging. Pest control is rudimentary at best. Mice, rats, and insects are your unwelcome roommates. You might look around your small, dark, smelly, and potentially lethal room and wonder about the rent. Surely this hovel can't cost much. Well, Rome was an expensive city. Rents, especially for such poor quality housing, could still be extortionate, consuming a large portion of a poor worker's meager income. Eviction was a constant threat if you fell behind. This brings us to a quirky, if depressing, tidbit. Some Roman landlords were notorious for maximizing their profits by illegally subdividing rooms, putting up flimsy partitions to create even smaller, more miserable living spaces to cram in yet more tenants. Imagine your already tiny room being split in half with a bit of wattle and daub. Cozy. It's a point of some scholarly debate as to the actual extent of any rent control or robust tenant rights in ancient Rome. While there were laws and societal expectations, the power imbalance between wealthy landlords, who were often influential senators or equestrians, and poor tenants was immense. Getting redress for a collapsing balcony or an unfair rent hike would have been an uphill battle, to say the least. Of course, not everyone in Rome lived like this. The wealthy elite resided in luxurious single-family homes called domus, often lavishly decorated with mosaics, frescoes, and filled with fine furniture. They had private courtyards, gardens, multiple rooms, running water, and even private bath suites. But these were the tiny minority. For the vast majority of Rome's inhabitants, the shopkeepers, the artisans, the laborers, the immigrants, the poor, the insula was home. A home that offered little security, little comfort, and a daily reminder of the precariousness of life in the ancient world. You sit on your straw-filled mattress, listening to the distant and not so distant sounds of the city. The light filtering through your tiny window is weak. You might feel a pang of claustrophobia, a longing for fresh air that doesn't smell of drains, for a solid floor beneath your feet, for a roof that doesn't look like it's actively plotting against you. This isn't a place to relax and unwind after a hard day. This is a place to snatch a few hours of uneasy sleep before facing another day of struggle. It certainly puts your own housing complaints into perspective, doesn't it? Maybe that dripping tap or the neighbor's slightly too loud music isn't so bad after all. You certainly wouldn't be calling a Roman landlord to complain about a bit of rising damp. You'd be too busy hoping the whole building doesn't follow suit. So you've experienced the dubious delights of your Roman digs. You're probably feeling a bit like a battery hen, cooped up in a precarious, smelly box. Now, let's talk about where you fit into this bustling, hierarchical society. Because in Rome, who you were, or rather, who your father was, determined almost everything about your life. Forget casually reinventing yourself or climbing the social ladder with a plucky attitude and a can-do spirit. Social mobility in ancient Rome was, for most people, a rather sticky wicket. First, you need to understand the basic structure. At the very top, you have the senatorial class. These are the fabulously wealthy, landowning aristocrats, the families who traced their lineage back for generations, sometimes even to the mythical founders of Rome. They held the top political offices, commanded armies, and generally ran the show. They wore special togas with a broad purple stripe, latus clavis, to signify their status. Think of them as the hereditary billionaires and political power brokers, all rolled into one. You, my friend, are almost certainly not one of them. If you were, you wouldn't be waking up in a sixth-floor fire trap. Below them, but still very much part of the elite, were the equites, or knights. Originally the cavalry class, by this period, they were more of a business and financial aristocracy. They were wealthy, often involved in trade, banking, and tax farming. They wore a toga with a narrow purple stripe, angustus clavis. They had significant influence, but generally didn't hold the very highest magistracies, though some could and did rise into the senatorial order. Again, probably not your league. Then comes the vast majority of freeborn Roman citizens, the plebeians. This group was incredibly diverse, ranging from reasonably well-off artisans and shopkeepers to the utterly destitute urban poor, the caput censi, the head count, those who owned no property and were counted only by their person. If you've been unceremoniously dumped into ancient Rome, this is most likely where you'd land, and probably towards the lower end of the spectrum. You are a citizen, which grants you certain rights. The right to vote, though its actual power varied greatly over time. The right to make contracts. The right to marry another citizen and have legitimate children. And crucially, the right not to be tortured or crucified, usually. But these rights don't automatically translate into a comfortable life. Below the plebeians in status, but often better off financially than the poorest citizens, were the freedmen, liberti. These were former slaves who had been manumitted, formally freed, by their masters. They gained citizenship, but with some restrictions. They couldn't hold high office, for example. However, many freedmen were highly skilled and ambitious, often continuing to work for their former masters in positions of trust, or setting up their own businesses. Some became incredibly wealthy. Their children, born free, would be full citizens without these restrictions. And at the very bottom, of course, were the slaves, servi. They were property with no rights whatsoever. They could be bought, sold, beaten, or killed at their master's whim. Slavery was endemic in Roman society, underpinning much of its economy. Slaves performed every conceivable type of labor, from backbreaking work in the mines and agricultural estates, to domestic service, skilled crafts, and even highly intellectual pursuits like teaching or accounting. Your fate as a slave was entirely dependent on the nature of your work and the character of your master. It could range from a life of unimaginable brutality to one of relative comfort and even influence within a household, but always without freedom. Let's just hope you haven't landed in this category, because your chances of lasting the day, let alone surviving, plummet dramatically. So, let's assume you're a poor plebeian. What does this mean for your daily life? It means you're largely powerless. It means you're probably struggling to make ends meet. And it means you are very likely a client to a wealthier patron. This brings us to the salutatio, the morning greeting ritual. As a client, you would be expected to show up at your patron's house very early in the morning, often before dawn, to pay your respects. You'd jostle with other clients in the courtyard, waiting for your turn to greet the great man, perhaps offer him some token of your esteem, or ask for a favor, legal help, a small loan, or, most commonly, the sportula. The sportula was originally a basket of food, but by the imperial period, it was often a small cash handout. This was, for many poor Romans, a vital part of their daily income, the difference between eating and starving. A mainstream historical fact, the patron-client system was a cornerstone of Roman social and political life, a complex web of reciprocal obligations that bound society together, from the highest aristocrat down to the poorest citizen. Imagine that. Your first task of the day, after your gritty bread, and before you even think about work, is to go and essentially beg, or at least perform ritualized deference, at someone else's doorstep. It's a system designed to reinforce the hierarchy, to remind everyone of their place. The patron gained prestige from the size of his crowd of clients. The clients gained a meager survival. It's a far cry from your independent, self-reliant, modern life. You'd have to learn the etiquette, who to flatter, how to ask without seeming too desperate or too demanding. It's a social minefield. Your status also dictates how you're treated in public. A wealthy man in a fine toga will command respect and deference. You, in your rough, possibly patched tunic, will be easily dismissed, pushed aside in the street, or treated with contempt by officials. Justice, too, was not always blind. The testimony of a rich man carried more weight than that of a poor one. The punishments for crimes also varied wildly based on social status. A noble convicted of a crime might face exile. A poor man convicted of the same crime could face a much harsher penalty, like being condemned to the mines or the arena. Now for a quirky tidbit related to social status and appearance. At various times in Roman history, there were sumptuary laws. These were laws designed to curb conspicuous consumption and reinforce social distinctions by regulating what people could wear, how lavishly they could entertain, or even what kind of food they could serve at banquets. For example, certain colors of dye, particularly Tyrian purple, an incredibly expensive dye made from sea snails, were restricted to the emperor or to those of high senatorial rank. The idea was to prevent the nouveau riche or lower classes from aping their betters and blurring the all-important social lines. Historians still debate how effectively these sumptuary laws were enforced, and many suspect they were widely flouted. But their very existence tells you a lot about how seriously Romans took their social hierarchy. You wouldn't want to be caught wearing a bit too much purple on your cheap tunic. It could lead to some very awkward questions, or, worse, the degree of actual social mobility, especially for those born into the lower echelons, is a subject of ongoing scholarly debate. While it wasn't impossible, a soldier might rise through the ranks and gain wealth and status, or a clever freedman might amass a fortune. For the vast majority, the circumstances of their birth largely determined the course of their life. The American dream of from rags to riches was a very, very distant prospect in ancient Rome. So, as you navigate your Roman day, you are constantly aware of your place. It's in the way people look at you, or through you, the way you have to make way for important-looking litters, the tone of voice a shopkeeper uses with you, the gnawing anxiety about where your next meal is coming from if you don't manage to secure your sportula. It's a heavy cloak, this social status, and not a comfortable one if you're on the lower rungs. You might find yourself longing for a society where you're judged on your merits, not your ancestry or your bank balance. But this is Rome. And in Rome, the old saying, "It's not what you know, it's who you know," was truer than ever, with the added corollary, "and who your daddy was." Good luck trying to impress anyone with your 21st century skills. They probably haven't been invented yet. And even if they had, you'd still need the right connections to get anyone to notice. Okay? You've got a very rough idea of your social standing, or lack thereof. You're probably a plebeian, possibly a client, and definitely not living the high life. So, what do you actually do all day in ancient Rome, apart from trying not to get crushed by a falling building or drenched by an upstairs neighbor's slops? It's time to think about your new Roman career. And let me tell you, the Roman concept of workers' rights and occupational health and safety was, shall we say, underdeveloped, as in non-existent, unless you're one of the idle rich, which, as we've established, you are not. or one of the destitute poor who rely solely on the sportula and public grain doles, the famous bread and circuses, you need to work. And Roman work, for the average person, was hard, often dangerous, and rarely paid well. Forget your air-conditioned office, your ergonomic chair, or your legally mandated lunch breaks. Your new workplace is probably going to be hot, dusty, noisy, and filled with myriad ways to get injured or worse. What kind of jobs are available? Well, if you're unskilled, you might end up as a general laborer. This could mean working on one of the many construction projects always underway in a city as vast and constantly evolving as Rome. You could be hauling heavy baskets of stone or concrete up rickety wooden scaffolding to build yet another insula, perhaps the very one that will collapse on you next year. A delightful thought. Or maybe you're down at the bustling river port, unloading sacks of grain, amphorae of wine, or blocks of marble from the ships that feed and supply the city. This is backbreaking work, from sunup to sundown, under the scorching Mediterranean sun in summer and in the damp chill of winter. Your foreman isn't going to be asking about your 5-year plan. He's more likely to be urging you on with a sharp tongue, or possibly something a bit more physical if you're slacking. If you have a trade, you might be a bit better off, but better off is relative. You could be a baker, working in the incredible heat of the ovens, covered in flour, kneading dough for endless loaves of that gritty Roman bread. Or a potter, a tanner, dealing with animal hides and some truly pungent chemicals. Remember the urine we talked about? It was also used in tanning. A cobbler, a carpenter, or a metal worker. Many of these trades were organized into collegia, which were essentially guilds or associations. This is a mainstream historical fact. These collegia provided a social network for their members, organized religious festivals, and, crucially, ensured proper burial for their members, a very important consideration in Roman society. However, they weren't trade unions in the modern sense. They generally didn't engage in collective bargaining for wages or working conditions. Wages? Don't expect to get rich? A typical unskilled laborer might earn a few sesterces a day. To put that in perspective, a loaf of bread might cost half a sestertius, a tunic might cost 15 sesterces, and your monthly rent for that lovely shoebox apartment could be a significant chunk of your earnings. You're working to survive, not to build up a savings account or plan a vacation to Baiae, the Roman equivalent of Las Vegas, but with more volcanic hot springs. The concept of a minimum wage is centuries away. Your employer pays what they can get away with, and there are always plenty of other desperate people willing to take your place if you complain. Let's consider some of the less desirable jobs, just for fun. You could be a fuller, one of those laundry workers we've affectionately mentioned. This involved treading on clothes in vats of water and alkaline substances like stale urine or fuller's earth, a type of clay. Imagine spending your day ankle-deep in other people's dirty laundry and pee. The smell alone would be an occupational hazard. Or, if you're really unlucky, you could end up in the mines. Mining for metals like gold, silver, lead, or copper was brutal, dangerous work, often done by slaves or condemned criminals. Collapsing tunnels, toxic fumes, and appalling conditions meant a short and miserable life. A rather quirky and grim tidbit is that some Roman mines, like those for sulfur, were so hazardous due to poisonous gases that workers could only spend very short periods inside, and even then, their health suffered immensely. You're definitely not angling for a job as a sulfur sniffer. Safety equipment? What's that? Hard hats? Steel-toed boots? Safety goggles? Not a chance. If you're a stonemason, you might get a chip of stone in your eye. If you're a dock worker, a heavy crate might crush your foot. If you're a carpenter, you might lose a finger to a poorly wielded saw. There's no workers' compensation, no disability pay. If you get injured and can't work, you're reliant on your family, your collegium, if you're in one. Or begging. It's a harsh reality. You'd develop a very keen sense of self-preservation, or you wouldn't last long. It's a subject of ongoing scholarly debate, how much oversight or regulation existed for working conditions in various Roman industries. While there were certainly building codes, like Augustus's height limit for insulae, and presumably some standards for weights and measures in markets, the day-to-day safety and well-being of individual workers seems to have been largely left to the discretion of employers or the workers themselves. There were no health and safety inspectors popping by your construction site to check if the scaffolding was secure. You just prayed to the gods it wouldn't give way while you were halfway up. Let's say you're lucky enough to be literate, a skill not universally held, though more common than in some other ancient societies. You might find work as a scribe, copying out documents or books by hand. This sounds less physically demanding, but imagine the eye strain, hunched over a scroll in dim light for hours on end, meticulously forming each letter. Or perhaps you could work as a clerk for a merchant, keeping accounts. Still, these white-collar jobs were few and far between compared to the vast demand for manual labor. You finish your workday, your body aching, covered in sweat and grime, your ears ringing from the noise. You've earned your few sesterces, enough for food, maybe a bit towards rent. The idea of job satisfaction, or career development, would seem like a bizarre, alien concept. You're just glad to have survived another day without serious injury or starvation. You might look at the wealthy senators gliding by in their litters and feel a pang of resentment, or perhaps just weary resignation. This is your lot. And tomorrow you'll get up and do it all over again. Suddenly, that boring office job with the slightly annoying coworker and the temperamental photocopier doesn't sound so bad, does it? At least your biggest occupational hazard is probably a paper cut, not being crushed by a poorly secured amphora of wine. Though, come to think of it, being crushed by an amphora of wine might be a slightly more glamorous Roman exit than some of the alternatives. Your Roman workday, a delightful experience of dust, sweat, and the constant, thrilling possibility of accidental dismemberment, is finally over. You've collected your meager pay, which feels depressingly light in your hand, considering the monumental effort you've put in. Your stomach, which has been rumbling a protest since that underwhelming breakfast, is now staging a full-blown rebellion. It's time for prandium, the Roman midday meal, or what you might consider lunch. But don't expect a quiet sandwich at your desk or leisurely cafe visit. Finding sustenance in the heart of Rome is another adventure in itself. A culinary gamble where the stakes are your continued digestive well-being. Unlike the main evening meal, cena, which could be a more elaborate affair, at least for those who could afford it, prandium for most working Romans was a quick, simple, and often on-the-go meal. You're not heading home to cook. Your tiny insula room probably doesn't have much in the way of kitchen facilities, beyond a small brazier, if that. And besides, who has the time? You need something fast, something cheap, and something that will keep you going until evening. This means you're likely heading to one of the numerous street food vendors or a thermopolium. A thermopolium, literally a place where something hot is sold, was the ancient Roman equivalent of a fast food joint or snack bar. This is a mainstream historical fact. These establishments were incredibly common throughout Roman cities, with archaeologists unearthing many examples in places like Pompeii and Herculaneum. They typically had an L-shaped counter opening onto the street, with large earthenware jars, dolia, sunk into the countertop, which would have contained hot food and drinks. You can just picture yourself sidling up to one of these, peering into the steaming jars, trying to decide what looks least likely to cause you immediate regret. What's on the menu? Don't expect a wide array of choices. You'd likely find simple, hearty fare. Stews made with beans, lentils, or vegetables, perhaps with a few scraps of meat if it's a slightly more upscale establishment, or if the butcher next door had some questionable offcuts to get rid of. Bread, of course, is a staple, probably the same dense, gritty kind you had for breakfast. Olives, cheese, some seasonal fruit like figs or grapes if you're lucky. And to drink? Water of dubious provenance, or more watered-down wine. The Roman love affair with wine continues, even at lunchtime. You point at a bubbling concoction in one of the dolia. The vendor, a portly fellow with a stained apron and a surprisingly cheerful demeanor, perhaps because he's not the one eating his own cooking, ladles a scoop onto a rough wooden platter or into a simple earthenware bowl. It smells interesting, a bit meaty, a bit herby, with an underlying tang you can't quite place. Is that garum? Ah, garum, the ubiquitous Roman fish sauce, made from fermented fish guts and blood salt and herbs, left to liquefy in the sun for months. This condiment was the Roman ketchup, soy sauce, and Worcestershire sauce all rolled into one. It was added to almost everything. A good quality garum was said to be complex and savory. A bad quality one? Well, let's just say it could be an acquired taste that you might not wish to acquire too quickly, especially if it's been sitting in a hot jar all day. This is a quirky, lesser-known tidbit, or perhaps a well-known one if you're into ancient culinary horrors. The variations in garum quality were immense, from prized, expensive varieties to cheap, rank stuff that likely contributed to many an upset Roman stomach. You hope your vendor sprung for the good stuff, or at least the not actively poisonous stuff. You find a spot to eat, perhaps perched on a low wall, or standing in a slightly less crowded alleyway. There are no designated picnic tables with cheerful red and white checked cloths. You eat with your fingers, or perhaps with a simple spoon if one was provided. As you tentatively try your stew, you glance around. The hygiene standards of these street food stalls are variable. Flies buzz enthusiastically around the food counters. The vendor wipes his hands on his already filthy apron. The water used for washing, if any washing is actually happening, is probably scooped from a nearby fountain that everyone else is using too. It's a culinary minefield. You know, you think to yourself, trying to identify a particularly chewy piece of alleged meat. A simple prepackaged sandwich from a refrigerated case has never sounded so appealing. The nutritional quality and safety of Roman street food is a topic of ongoing scholarly debate. While it undoubtedly provided essential sustenance for a large part of the urban population, who lacked private cooking facilities, the risks of food contamination, spoilage, especially in the heat, and adulteration were very real. There were no health inspectors giving out star ratings, no best before dates. You relied on your eyes, your nose, and a healthy dose of luck. A sudden cramp in your stomach a few hours later could be the first sign that your lunchtime gamble didn't pay off. You might see other options besides the thermopolia: hawkers selling nuts, roasted chickpeas, or small pastries. Perhaps a vendor with a portable oven baking a kind of flatbread. The smells mingle in the air, some appetizing, like baking bread or roasting meat, others less so. The ever-present aroma of garum hangs heavy in some quarters. You try to choose wisely, but your modern sensibilities are screaming at you. You remember all those food safety documentaries you've watched, all those warnings about cross-contamination and improper food handling. Your Roman vendor would probably just laugh and offer you another ladleful of his mystery stew. Good for you. Puts hairs on your chest, he might bellow, while swatting away a particularly persistent fly. You finish your meal hoping for the best. It wasn't gourmet, it wasn't particularly clean, but it was food, and you needed it. As you wipe your greasy fingers on your tunic, because napkins are a luxury you can't afford, you can't help but feel a new appreciation for the strict food hygiene standards back in your own time. You make a mental note. If you somehow get transported back, pack hand sanitizer. Lots and lots of hand sanitizer. And maybe some emergency rations, like a lifetime supply of energy bars. The lunch break, such as it was, is over. There's no lingering over coffee, still no coffee. No leisurely chat with colleagues. It's back to work, or on to the next part of your Roman day. Perhaps a visit to the baths to wash off the grime and the stress of your culinary adventure. You just hope that whatever you ate decides to stay put and not stage a dramatic reappearance at an inconvenient moment, like when you're in a crowded public bathhouse. Now that would be awkward, even by Roman standards. Your dubious lunch is settling, hopefully, and the grime of the Roman streets and your even grimier workplace is starting to feel like a second skin. Your tunic is probably clinging to you in a rather unpleasant way, and you smell ripe. Even by Roman standards, you might be starting to offend. So, what's a dusty, sweaty, and slightly anxious transplant from the future to do? It's time to head to the baths. This isn't just about getting clean. It's a social ritual, a cornerstone of Roman daily life, and an experience that will be quite unlike any spa day you've ever had. Prepare for bathing with a lot of strangers. A lot. The Roman public baths, or thermae, were magnificent structures, especially the grand imperial baths in Rome like those of Caracalla or Diocletian. These weren't just places to wash. They were vast leisure complexes, often including libraries, lecture halls, gardens, gymnasia, and food stalls. Entry was usually very cheap, or even free, making them accessible to almost everyone, from senators to slaves, though slaves might attend at different times or use less opulent facilities. This is a mainstream historical fact. The baths were a democratic institution in many ways, a place where different social classes could mingle, though social distinctions were still, of course, observed. You arrive at the entrance of a bathhouse. It might be a grand, marble-clad edifice or a more modest neighborhood establishment. Even from outside, you can hear the echoing clamor of voices, the splashing of water, and feel a waft of warm, steamy air. You pay your small entrance fee, perhaps a quadrans, the smallest Roman coin, and step inside. First, you head to the apoditerium, the changing room. This is a bustling, noisy space, likely lined with stone benches and niches or shelves where you can leave your clothes. And here's your first challenge. Security. There were no lockers with convenient little keys. Attendants, capsarii, might watch over a section of clothes for a small tip, but theft was a notorious problem in Roman baths. You'd be wise not to leave anything valuable, since all you possess is your probably rather fragrant tunic and sandals. Maybe you're less of a target. You strip off your clothes, along with every other man, woman, and child doing the same. Though many baths had separate sections or hours for men and women, the extent of mixed bathing is a subject of ongoing scholarly debate, and likely varied by location and period. You are now naked, surrounded by a sea of other naked Romans of all shapes, sizes, and ages. Try not to make direct eye contact. It's like a particularly crowded nudist beach, but indoors and with worse acoustics. Now, how do you get clean? Not with a bar of fragrant soap and a loofah. Instead, you'll need olive oil and a strigil. The strigil is a curved metal scraper, usually made of bronze or iron. You, or a slave if you had one and brought them along, would rub olive oil all over your body. Then you use the strigil to scrape off the oil, along with all the dirt, sweat, and dead skin. It's a surprisingly effective, if somewhat alarming, method of exfoliation. This quirky tidbit, the oil and strigil method, is fundamental to understanding Roman bathing. The gunk scraped off, known as strigmentum, was considered by some athletes to be a potent rub-down, though you'd probably just want it disposed of. Quickly, from the changing room, you typically follow a specific sequence of rooms with different temperatures. First, you might head to the palestra, an open-air courtyard or exercise ground, to work up a sweat. Wrestling, weightlifting with stone dumbbells, ball games, it was all on offer. Imagine trying to play a dignified game of catch while entirely in the buff. Humbling, to say the least. After your workout, or if you decide to skip the public display of athletic, non-prowess, you proceed to the tepidarium, the warm room. This was a transitional space, heated by underfloor and wall heating systems, the hypocaust system, an ingenious Roman invention. The air is pleasantly warm and steamy. You relax, acclimatize, maybe chat with your fellow bathers. This is where the social aspect really kicks in. Business deals were made, gossip was exchanged, philosophies debated, all while lounging around in a state of nature. You might feel a bit out of your depth, trying to follow a rapid-fire Latin conversation about chariot race odds, while simultaneously trying not to slip on the damp mosaic floor. Next, it's time for the caldarium, the hot room. This is serious heat. It's like a sauna or a steam room, often with a hot water pool, alveus for soaking. The air is thick with steam, the temperature intense. You sweat profusely, opening up your pores. This is where the main scraping with the strigil would often happen. If you didn't bring your own slave to do the honors, you might hire an attendant, or perhaps a friend would help you with the hard-to-reach spots. It's an intimate and slightly odd bonding experience. Could you get my back, mate? Just under the left shoulder blade. And try not to take off too much skin. There's a good chap. After you've been thoroughly steamed, oiled, and scraped to within an inch of your life, you'll be amazed at the amount of grime that comes off. It's both disgusting and deeply satisfying. You need to cool down. So, off to the frigidarium, the cold room. This usually featured a large, unheated pool of refreshing cold water. The shock of plunging into the cold water after the intense heat of the caldarium was considered invigorating and essential for closing the pores. It would certainly wake you up. Imagine the shriek you'd let out. Much to the amusement of the seasoned Roman bathers, you emerge from the frigidarium, shivering slightly, but feeling remarkably clean. Cleaner, in fact, than you felt since your arrival in this ancient odorous world. Your skin is tingling. You feel refreshed, revitalized. You've survived the public nudity, the scraping, the extreme temperatures, and the potential for awkward social encounters. You might even feel good. The Roman baths were clearly more than just a wash. They were a deeply ingrained social and cultural institution, a place for health, relaxation, and community. You head back to the Apoditerium, hoping your tunic is still there. As you dry off, with linen towels if provided, or you just air dry, you might reflect on the experience. It was loud, crowded, intensely public, and involved a lot more scraping than you're used to. But there was also something undeniably effective and communal about it. You can see why Romans loved their baths. It was a daily escape, a small luxury available to almost everyone. You, however, might still be slightly traumatized by the sheer volume of naked flesh and the close encounters with strangers' strigils. And you're definitely hoping that communal olive oil wasn't, recycled. Best not to think about it. Just enjoy feeling clean. For now, feeling remarkably and perhaps surprisingly clean after your adventures in the Roman baths, you might think it's time for a quiet evening, maybe a nice scroll by lamplight. But Romans had a hearty appetite for entertainment, and quiet wasn't always high on the agenda. If it's a festival day, or if some wealthy magistrate or the emperor himself is feeling generous, you might find yourself swept along with the crowds towards one of Rome's great entertainment venues, like the Colosseum or the Circus Maximus. Prepare yourself, because Roman entertainment was not for the faint of heart, the easily offended, or anyone with a strong aversion to watching people and animals meet sticky ends. Let's imagine it's a day for the games. Ludi. These could involve theatrical performances, chariot races, or the most famous and infamous of all, gladiatorial contests and wild animal hunts, venacion. The Colosseum, or Flavian Amphitheater, that iconic symbol of Rome, could hold an estimated 50,000 to 80,000 spectators, all baying for excitement and often for blood. This is a mainstream historical fact. These games were hugely expensive spectacles, often sponsored by emperors or ambitious politicians as a way to curry favor with the populace. The circuses, part of Juvenal's Bread and Circuses, panem et circenses. You find yourself part of a massive throng surging towards the amphitheater. The noise is incredible, even from a distance. The roar of the crowd, the blare of trumpets, the cries of vendors selling snacks, perhaps some slightly less dubious sausages than your lunchtime fare, and official programs detailing the day's matchups. Entry was usually free, but seating was strictly according to social class. Senators and equestrians got the best seats down near the arena, while the poor, women, and slaves were relegated to the upper tiers, the ancient equivalent of the nosebleed section. You, naturally, are scrambling for a spot high up, with a bird's-eye view of the carnage. The show might begin with venations, the wild animal hunts. Exotic beasts from all corners of the empire. Lions, tigers, bears, elephants, rhinos, crocodiles were brought to Rome to be hunted and killed in the arena. Sometimes they fought each other. Sometimes they were pitted against specially trained hunters called bestiari. It was a display of Rome's power over nature, its vast reach, but it was also brutal and bloody. You watch, heart in your throat, as a cornered lion, magnificent and terrified, is speared by a hunter. The crowd roars its approval. You feel a wave of nausea. This isn't like watching a nature documentary. This is visceral, real, and horrifyingly cruel. Then come the gladiators. These men, and occasionally women, though this was rarer and often scandalous, were usually slaves, prisoners of war, or condemned criminals, though some free men, desperate for fame or fortune, volunteered. They were rigorously trained in special schools, ludi, and fought with a variety of weapons and armor. This is a quirky tidbit. The different types of gladiators were highly specialized, creating exciting and varied matchups. For example, you might see a retiarius, lightly armed with a net, trident, and dagger, pitted against a heavily armored secutor with a sword and shield, or a Thracian with a curved sword and small round shield, or a Myrmio with a fish-crested helmet. Each had their strengths and weaknesses, and the crowd would often have their favorites. Like fans of modern wrestlers or boxers, the gladiators parade into the arena, perhaps saluting the emperor or the presiding magistrate with the traditional, though possibly apocryphal for every occasion, Ave Imperator, morituri te salutant. Hail, Emperor, those who are about to die salute you. The trumpets blare, the crowd screams, and the combat begins. It's fast, brutal, and incredibly skillful. These men are fighting for their lives. You see the flash of steel, hear the clang of weapons on armor, the grunts of exertion, the roar of the crowd urging them on. When a gladiator is wounded and falls, he might raise a finger to appeal for mercy. The decision often rested with the sponsor of the games, but the crowd's reaction, thumbs up for mercy, missio, meaning release or pardon, or thumbs down, or some other gesture, the exact nature of which is still debated by scholars. For death, carried enormous weight. It's a point of significant scholarly debate whether every gladiatorial contest truly ended in death. While death was certainly a frequent outcome, especially for less skilled or less popular fighters, experienced and crowd-pleasing gladiators were valuable assets. They might be spared to fight another day if they fought bravely, even in defeat. Granting missio could also be a way for the sponsor to show clemency and win favor. However, the ever-present possibility of death was what gave the games their terrifying thrill for the Roman audience. You watch, horrified, yet strangely mesmerized. Your 21st century sensibilities are screaming in protest. This is barbaric. How can people cheer for this? But around you, Romans of all ages are on their feet, shouting, completely caught up in the spectacle. It's a sobering reminder of the vast cultural gulf between your time and theirs. For them, this was normal, exciting, a release from the drudgery of daily life. It reinforced Roman virtues of courage, discipline, and contempt for death. For you, it's a stomach-churning display of cruelty. And you thought cage fighting was intense. You mutter to yourself, feeling a bit faint. Alternatively, you might be at the Circus Maximus for the chariot races. This was arguably even more popular than gladiatorial combat. The Circus Maximus was a colossal stadium, capable of holding up to 250,000 spectators. The noise, the excitement, the sheer scale of it would be overwhelming. 4 factions, the Reds, Whites, Blues, and Greens, competed, each with fiercely loyal fans. Betting was rampant. The races were incredibly dangerous. 4-horse chariots, quadrigae, thundering around a narrow track, jostling for position, wheels locking, chariots crashing, drivers thrown to be trampled by horses or dragged by the reins, which they often wrapped around their waists. They carried a knife to cut themselves free if they had time. It was high octane, high risk, and utterly thrilling for the Roman crowd. Less directly about human-on-human killing, but still incredibly perilous. You find yourself gripping your stone seat, shouting along with everyone else as your chosen color, you picked green on a whim, takes the lead, then gasping in horror as a multi-chariot pileup occurs on the far turn. Whether it's the bloody sands of the Colosseum or the dusty track of the circus, Roman entertainment is a full sensory assault. The roar of the crowd, the smell of sweat, dust, animals, and perhaps even blood, the blazing sun, the raw emotion. It's a far cry from passively watching Netflix. You leave the venue feeling dazed, deafened, and deeply disturbed. You might have a newfound appreciation for the concept of PG-13 entertainment, and you'll definitely be looking over your shoulder for anyone with a net and trident for the rest of the day. That kind of thing leaves an impression. All right, you've survived the gladiatorial games, or perhaps a chaotic chariot race, and your nerves are thoroughly frayed. Your modern ethical compass is spinning like a broken gyroscope, and you're probably feeling a desperate need for something calm and private. Well, life in ancient Rome has a way of consistently denying you such simple comforts. As the day wears on, another fundamental human need makes itself known. You need the toilet. But in Rome, answering nature's call is rarely a solitary or discreet affair. Prepare for the adventure of the Roman public potty. You're out and about, perhaps making your way back from the Colosseum. Or maybe you're still trying to navigate the crowded streets after your bathing experience. Suddenly, that lunchtime stew and the copious amounts of watered-down wine you've been hydrating with decide it's time for an encore, or at least a swift exit. Panic begins to set in. Where do you go? Your tiny insula room, with its trusty chamber pot, might be miles away, or up 6 flights of rickety stairs. Not ideal for an emergency. You start looking around desperately. You might spot a sign, or more likely, you'll follow your nose, unfortunately, or ask a local for the nearest forica or latrina. These were public latrines, and they were a common feature in Roman cities. This is a mainstream historical fact. Roman engineering extended to sanitation, and many public latrines were quite sophisticated for their time, often featuring a system of continuously running water beneath the seats to carry away waste into the city's sewers. Sounds relatively hygienic, right? Well, hold that thought. You finally locate one. It might be a dedicated building, or perhaps part of a larger public complex like the baths or a forum. You step inside, and the first thing that strikes you is the openness. Roman public latrines were often designed with long benches made of stone or marble, with multiple holes carved into them, set side by side. We're talking 10, 20, sometimes even more seats, all in a row, with absolutely no partitions or privacy screens between them. Imagine a long piano bench, but with toilet seats. You find yourself sitting shoulder to shoulder with a dozen or so complete strangers, all attending to the same pressing business. There's no locking a cubicle door behind you. No polite pretense that you're all alone in your own little world. This is a communal experience, whether you like it or not. You nervously choose an empty spot, trying to avoid making eye contact with your new temporary neighbors. Some of them might be chatting amiably, discussing the latest chariot race results, or complaining about the price of olives. Others might be grunting with effort. It's an astonishingly public way to perform a very private act. You, accustomed to the sanctity of the modern bathroom stall, feel incredibly exposed. You try to focus on a particularly interesting crack in the marble floor. Then comes the question of cleanup. You look around. No neatly stacked rolls of soft quilted toilet paper. Instead, you might see a bucket or a channel of water containing a xylospongium or tersorium. And here's your quirky and frankly rather horrifying tidbit for this section. This was essentially a natural sea sponge attached to a stick, and yes, it was communal. After use, it would be rinsed in the running water or a vinegar saltwater solution and left for the next person. The thought of sharing a toilet sponge with a succession of anonymous Romans is probably enough to make your insides clench in an entirely different way. You suddenly remember that rough, scratchy tunic you're wearing and contemplate its alternative uses. Or maybe you just drip dry and hope for the best. It's a tough call. The social etiquette of these public latrines is something scholars still ponder. Were they indeed lively social hubs? As some anecdotal evidence suggests, places where people exchanged news and gossip while enthroned? Or was it a more perfunctory, if public, affair? It's hard to imagine having a deep philosophical discussion while your neighbor is audibly struggling. But Romans clearly had a different concept of personal space and bodily privacy than we do. Perhaps the constant running water helped to mask some of the less pleasant acoustics. One can only hope. Hygiene, despite the running water, was likely still a concern. While the sewers carried waste away, the communal nature of the facilities, especially that shared sponge, meant that the spread of intestinal parasites and diseases was probably quite common. You might see mosaics on the floor, sometimes depicting marine life, perhaps to evoke the watery theme, or even apotropaic symbols intended to ward off evil spirits or bad luck, which some Romans associated with latrines. A little good luck charm on the floor is probably not going to do much against a rampant E. coli infection. But hey, every little bit helps, right? You might also find graffiti on the walls, just like in modern public restrooms. Romans were prolific graffiti artists, leaving their mark everywhere, from declarations of love to political slogans to crude jokes. So, while you're uncomfortably perched, you could at least entertain yourself by trying to decipher some ancient Roman bathroom humor. Gaius was here, or perhaps something a bit more R-rated. The whole experience is a masterclass in cultural dissonance. You, who probably feel a bit awkward using a public restroom if someone is in the next stall, are now literally rubbing elbows, well, almost, with your fellow Romans in a moment of shared relief. You try to be quick, efficient, and get out of there as fast as humanly possible. You make a mental note to pray to Cloacina, the Roman goddess of sewers, for a swift and uneventful recovery from this particular ordeal. And you vow to be much, much more careful about your fluid intake for the rest of your imaginary Roman day. As you emerge, blinking, into the relative freshness of the Roman street, and freshness is a very relative term here, you feel a profound sense of gratitude for the invention of private bathrooms and individual toilet paper rolls. It's one of those modern conveniences you completely take for granted until you're faced with the alternative. You might also feel a strange sort of camaraderie with the Romans you just shared that bench with. You've all been through something together, something unique, something you'll probably try very hard to forget, but never quite managed to. And if you thought that was an adventure, just wait until you try to go shopping. You've braved the public latrines, an experience that has undoubtedly left you feeling changed, and perhaps slightly traumatized. But life, even in ancient Rome, goes on, and there are still things you need. Food for your, hopefully more private, evening meal. Perhaps a new pair of sandals if your current ones are about to give up the ghost after all that street trudging. Or maybe just a cheap oil lamp to ward off the oppressive darkness of your insular room. It's time to head to the market. But forget calm, orderly supermarkets with clearly priced items and helpful staff. A Roman market is a vibrant, chaotic, and often overwhelming assault on the senses, where bargaining is an art form and customer service is a concept yet to be invented. You find yourself drawn towards one of Rome's many specialized markets, or perhaps a larger, more general form that also serves as a commercial hub, like the Forum Boarium, the cattle market, or the Forum Holatorium, the vegetable market. Or maybe you're in a bustling neighborhood market tucked away in the labyrinthine streets of the Subura. The noise hits you first. A cacophony of vendors shouting their wares, customers haggling loudly, animals bleating or squawking, because live animals were often sold for food, and the general hubbub of 1,000 conversations. It's even more intense than the general street noise, if that's possible. The smells are a wild mix. The sweet scent of ripe fruit from one stall, the pungent aroma of cheese from another, the metallic tang of freshly butchered meat, the earthy smell of vegetables still caked in soil, and, of course, the ever-present background notes of dust, sweat, and questionable sanitation. Stalls are crammed together, piled high with goods. Merchants, often with booming voices and theatrical gestures, try to lure you in. Best olives in Rome, fresh from Baetica. Finest wool, madam, soft as a cloud. Get your genuine lucky amulets here. Ward off the evil eye. You need to buy some food. You approach a stall selling vegetables, piles of leafy greens, root vegetables, perhaps some onions and garlic. They look rustic. Definitely organic, by default, but also probably unwashed and sporting a few insect holes. The vendor, a stout woman with flour on her apron, or is it dust, eyes you shrewdly. There are no price tags. This is where the fun begins. You point at some leeks. She names a price, in sesterces, asses, or even quadrantes, depending on the value. You, having absolutely no idea what a fair price for leeks is in 2nd century Rome, probably look a bit bewildered. This is your cue to haggle. If you just accept the first price, you'll be marked as an easy target for the rest of your shopping trip. A mainstream historical fact, bargaining was an expected and integral part of Roman commerce, especially in the markets. Fixed prices were not the norm for most everyday goods, so you try your hand at it. Too much, you declare, trying to sound confident. The vendor scoffs, launches into a monologue about the quality of her leeks, the cost of transport, the blight that wiped out half the crop last season. You counter-offer a lower price. She looks scandalized. This verbal dance can go back and forth several times. It's a performance, a test of wills. You might actually find it quite exhilarating if you get into the spirit of it. Or you might just find it utterly exhausting and wish for a simple barcode scanner. Then there's the quality. You need to inspect everything carefully. That plump-looking fig might be rotten on the underside. That piece of cheese might be a bit too lively. Caveat emptor. Let the buyer beware. is the ruling principle here. Once you've paid your money, there are no refunds, no exchanges, no customer complaint department to call. You get what you pay for, or rather, what you manage to negotiate for. And if it turns out to be substandard, well, that's your tough luck. You learn quickly to prod the fruit, sniff the fish, and generally be a bit more hands-on than you would in a modern grocery store. Let's say you're looking for something other than food. Perhaps a new pair of sandals. You find a cobbler's stall, sandals of various styles and qualities hanging up for display. Again, you haggle. You try them on, right there in the bustling market, hoping your feet aren't too offensive after your day's adventures. The cobbler might point out the sturdy stitching, the quality of the leather. You point out a scuff mark. It's all part of the game. Here's a quirky tidbit about Roman shopping. Some Roman shops, particularly those selling luxury goods or operating in more upscale areas, had shop signs that were not just text-based, but often pictorial. Since literacy wasn't universal, a carved relief or a painting depicting the goods or services offered, like a goat for a dairy or an amphora for a wine shop, was an effective way to advertise. You might see a sign with a cleverly carved bunch of grapes indicating a wine cellar, or even more specialized symbols that locals would understand. It was ancient branding in a way. The atmosphere in the market is electric. It's crowded, you're constantly being jostled, and you need to keep a firm grip on your coin purse, if you have one. Most likely, you're just clutching your few hard-earned sesterces in your hand. Pickpockets thrive in these conditions. But it's also a place of incredible vitality, a microcosm of Roman life. You see people from all walks of life, though wealthier Romans would often send their slaves to do the marketing. You hear snippets of gossip, news from distant parts of the empire, arguments, laughter. It's a full-on sensory experience. One thing scholars still discuss is the exact layout and organization of some of the larger Roman market complexes, like Trajan's Market. While the impressive ruins give us a good idea of the scale and structure, understanding the precise flow of goods, the specific types of shops in each section, and the daily commercial rhythm is an ongoing process of archaeological and historical detective work. These weren't just random collections of stalls. They were often carefully planned commercial districts. You finally complete your purchases. A few vegetables, a small chunk of cheese, maybe a new wick for your oil lamp. Your purse is lighter, your arms are full, and your head is spinning from the noise and the constant negotiation. You feel a sense of accomplishment, though. You've successfully navigated the Roman marketplace, bartered for your goods, and emerged relatively unscathed and unfleeced, you hope. It makes that weekly trip to Tesco seem like a walk in the park. You might even have picked up a slightly bruised apple for a surprisingly good price after a particularly spirited round of haggling. Small victories. But as you head back towards your insula, clutching your provisions, you can't help but wonder what you'll do if that cheese turns out to be mostly rind, or if the leeks are all woody. There's no writing a bad Yelp review for Agrippina's questionable leeks. You just live and learn. Or in ancient Rome, you live, learn, and hope you don't get food poisoning. You've successfully procured some slightly suspect provisions from the market, and you're feeling rather proud of your haggling skills. But let's say that during your day of Roman adventures, perhaps a slip on those treacherous cobblestones, a nasty splinter from your shoddy insula door, or maybe that lunchtime stew is starting to enact its revenge in a particularly violent fashion. You find yourself in need of medical attention. Oh dear, If you thought navigating Roman streets or public potties was an ordeal, seeking health care in ancient Rome is an experience that will truly test your will to live. Forget clean hospitals, sterile equipment, and evidence-based medicine. You're about to enter a world of humors, herbs, and a whole lot of hopeful wishing. Your first challenge is finding a doctor or medicus. There was no national Roman health service, no convenient GP surgery just down the road. Doctors were private practitioners, and their skill, training, and ethical standards varied wildly. Many were Greek, as Greek medicine was highly regarded. Some were highly educated and respected, writing learned treatises and attending to wealthy families. Others were little more than quacks, charlatans preying on the sick and desperate with useless or even harmful remedies. You, as a person of modest means, are unlikely to get an appointment with Galen himself. You're more likely to end up with a local practitioner whose qualifications are questionable. You ask around. Perhaps your insular neighbors or a friendly shopkeeper can recommend someone. You're directed to a small shop front, or perhaps the doctor works out of their home. The waiting room, if such a thing exists, is probably just a crowded anteroom, filled with other ailing Romans coughing, groaning, and generally looking miserable. The air is thick with the smell of herbs, sickness, and a faint, unnerving metallic tang you can't quite place. Not exactly reassuring. Finally, it's your turn. You're ushered into a small room to see the medicus. It was almost always a he, though female doctors, medicash, did exist, particularly for women's health and midwifery, might look you over, ask a few questions about your symptoms, perhaps poke you a bit. Diagnosis was based largely on observation and the prevailing medical theory of the time, which was heavily influenced by the Greek concept of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Illness was believed to be caused by an imbalance of these humors. This is a mainstream historical fact. Humoral theory dominated Western medical thinking for over 2 millennia, well into the 19th century. So, your Roman doctor is trying to figure out which of your humors is out of whack. Treatment will be aimed at restoring this balance. This might involve dietary changes, e.g., avoid cold, moist foods if you have too much phlegm. Herbal remedies, some of which might actually have had some beneficial properties, others just useless weeds. Or more invasive procedures. Bloodletting was a very common treatment for a huge range of ailments, the idea being to remove excess blood or bad blood. The doctor might use a lancet to open a vein, or apply leeches. You eye the rather unsterile-looking metal tools on his table with growing alarm. Are you sure about this, Doc? I just twisted my ankle. Surgery was performed, but it was incredibly risky. Without effective anesthesia, they might use opium, mandrake, or henbane, but their effects were unpredictable and dosage critical. And with no understanding of germ theory and antiseptic practices, even minor surgical procedures could easily lead to infection and death. Roman surgeons were skilled at treating battlefield wounds, setting broken bones, and even performing some surprisingly complex operations, like cataract removal or trepanation, drilling a hole in the skull, perhaps to relieve pressure or release evil spirits, a truly terrifying prospect. However, the survival rates for internal surgery were abysmal. You're fervently hoping your ailment doesn't require anything involving a scalpel. Here's a quirky and rather unsettling tidbit about Roman medicine. Some remedies involved ingredients that would make your stomach churn. Pliny the Elder's Natural History is full of them. For epilepsy, he recommends things like drinking gladiator's blood or eating certain animal testicles. For a cough, perhaps boiled earthworms. For a sore throat, ashes of a swallow's nest mixed with honey. While it's debated how widely these more extreme folk remedies were actually used by professional medici, who often preferred more rational, if still flawed, approaches, their existence highlights the desperation and the sometimes bizarre beliefs surrounding health and healing. You sincerely hope your doctor isn't a Big Pliny fan when it comes to his prescriptions. 2 earthworms and call me in the morning is not what you want to hear. The concept of a placebo effect was probably working overtime in ancient Rome. The doctor's confident demeanor, the impressive-sounding Greek terminology, the exotic ingredients, all of this might have convinced some patients they were getting better, even if the treatment itself was inert. And of course, many illnesses are self-limiting. People get better on their own, and the doctor gets the credit. One area where Roman medicine, or rather public health, did excel was in sanitation and hygiene, at least on a municipal level. The aqueducts, sewers, and public baths, while not perfect, undoubtedly contributed to a healthier urban environment than in many other ancient and even later medieval cities. However, individual medical practice was still very much a hit-or-miss affair. The extent to which Roman doctors adhered to ethical principles, such as those outlined in the Hippocratic Oath, which originated in Greece but influenced Roman medical thought, is a subject of ongoing scholarly discussion. While some doctors were undoubtedly dedicated and compassionate, the lack of regulation meant that others were free to exploit their patients with impunity. So you receive your diagnosis, probably too much black bile, my friend, causing melancholy and this unfortunate boil. And your prescription, perhaps some bitter herbs to chew, a poultice of bread and milk for the boil, and strict instructions to avoid melons. You pay the doctor his fee. Medical care wasn't free, and costs could vary enormously. You leave clutching your herbs, feeling not entirely reassured. Your ankle still throbs, or your stomach still churns, and you have a sneaking suspicion that the main thing the doctor relieved you of was a few sesterces. You find yourself fervently hoping for the best, relying on your own immune system and a healthy dose of luck. It's a stark reminder of how vulnerable people were in the ancient world when faced with illness or injury. Suddenly, that slightly dismissive GP back home who always seems to be running late and just tells you to take paracetamol seems like a medical genius. At least they're unlikely to suggest a course of roasted dormice or try to balance your humors with a rusty knife. You make a solemn vow to appreciate modern medicine and to be incredibly careful for the rest of your imaginary Roman stay. No more risky street food. No more leaping across puddles. Your health, you realize, is even more precarious here than your social standing. You've navigated the perilous world of Roman healthcare, and hopefully, you're still in one piece, albeit perhaps with a new appreciation for 21st century antibiotics and a lingering suspicion of anyone offering you a herbal poultice. As evening draws in, a different set of challenges emerges. Daylight, with all its noise and chaos, is fading. Darkness in ancient Rome isn't just the absence of light. It's a shroud that brings with it a whole new cast of dangers, anxieties, and a profound sense of isolation, especially if you're trying to make your way back to your precarious perch in that insula. The sun dips below the horizon, and the city begins to transform. The clamor of the daytime markets and workshops subsides, replaced by a different soundscape. You might hear the distant revelry from a wealthy Roman's dinner party Sina, the barking of stray dogs, the mournful hoot of an owl, or perhaps just an eerie, unsettling quiet in the narrower, unlit alleyways. Street lighting as we know it simply didn't exist. Main thoroughfares might get some illumination from lamps outside prosperous homes or shops, or from the occasional brazier, but most of Rome's labyrinthine streets and alleys would be plunged into near total darkness. This is a mainstream historical fact. The lack of public street lighting made navigating Roman cities at night incredibly hazardous. It wasn't just about tripping over uneven paving stones or falling into an open drain, though those were certainly risks. The darkness provided cover for less savory activities. Crime rates, particularly robbery and assault, were significantly higher after dark. Wealthy Romans would rarely venture out at night without an escort of slaves carrying torches or lanterns, and often armed bodyguards. You, however, are on your own, clutching your recently purchased, and hopefully not too stale, loaf of bread, trying to remember which dimly lit, identical-looking alleyway leads back to your insula. The shadows play tricks on your eyes. Every dark doorway looks menacing. Every rustle in a pile of refuse could be a lurking threat. You jump at the sound of a cat knocking over a loose tile. Your heart is pounding. You remember all those lurid tales from Roman satirists like Juvenal, who painted a vivid picture of the perils of nighttime Rome, from muggers and drunken gangs to the ever-present danger of things being thrown out of windows from above. That warning shout of cave is even more terrifying when you can't see what's about to descend upon you. Is it just dirty water or something heavier? You quicken your pace, hugging the walls, trying to make yourself as small a target as possible. If you live in one of those multi-story insulae, just getting to your room is an ordeal. The stairwells, often narrow, wooden, and rickety even in daylight, are now pitch black. You stumble your way up, hands outstretched, feeling for the walls, praying you don't miss a step or trip over another tenant who's decided to sleep in the hallway because their room is too hot or too crowded. The insula itself might be eerily quiet or disturbingly noisy with the sounds of arguments, domestic disputes, or someone snoring with the power of a legionary trumpet, all amplified by the thin walls. Once you finally make it to your small room, the darkness is oppressive. You fumble for your new oil lamp and a flint and steel to light it. The tiny flame flickers to life, casting dancing shadows on the rough walls. It provides a small pool of light, just enough to see by, but it does little to dispel the gloom that presses in from the unglazed window slit. This single, smoky, smelly oil lamp is your only defense against the night, and oil wasn't free. You'd use it sparingly. Here's a quirky, lesser-known tidbit about Roman nights. Despite the dangers, some aspects of city life continued after dark. Heavy freight wagons, which were often banned from the city center during the day to reduce congestion, were allowed to enter and move goods at night. So, just as you're trying to drift off to sleep, you might hear the rumble of iron-shod wheels on cobblestones and the shouts of teamsters guiding their oxen or mules through the darkened streets. Not exactly conducive to a peaceful night's rest. The psychological impact of this profound darkness is also worth considering. For us, true darkness is rare. Even in rural areas, there's usually some ambient light from distant towns or the moon. But in an ancient city without widespread artificial illumination, night was a different entity altogether. A time when the world shrank to the immediate vicinity of your lamp and the unknown pressed in from all sides. It's little wonder that ghost stories and tales of supernatural beings lurking in the shadows were popular. The Roman author Pliny the Younger famously wrote a detailed account of a haunted house, complete with clanking chains and a spectral old man. You lie on your straw pallet, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the Roman night, and find yourself half expecting a ghostly legionary to materialize in the corner of your room. One of the ongoing debates among historians concerns the true level of nocturnal activity and safety in Rome. While literary sources often emphasize the dangers, archaeological evidence from some cities shows that certain commercial activities, like bakeries preparing bread for the morning, or even some taverns, might have continued to operate into the night, creating small pockets of light and activity. However, for the average citizen traversing a poorly lit residential area, the risks were undoubtedly very real. You try to settle down, but every creak of the insula's structure, every distant shout, every scurrying sound from the corner, is that a rat or just your imagination running wild, puts you on edge. Sleep feels like a distant prospect. You're acutely aware of your vulnerability. If someone tries to break into your flimsy door, there's no police emergency number to call. You're on your own. The reassuring hum of the refrigerator, the gentle glow of a streetlight outside your window, the knowledge that help is just a phone call away. All these modern comforts are absent. There is just you, your sputtering oil lamp, and the vast, indifferent Roman night. You pull your rough blanket tighter, close your eyes, and hope that dawn comes quickly, and that the floorboards above you don't decide tonight is the night they finally give way. Sweet dreams? Not likely. You've somehow made it through the terrors of a Roman night, or at least part of it. Maybe you've even managed a few fitful hours of sleep, punctuated by mysterious scuttling sounds and the distant rumble of late-night cart traffic. As you lie there, or perhaps as you first put on your Roman attire at the start of this very long imaginary day, let's consider your clothing. Because what you're wearing in ancient Rome isn't just a matter of personal taste, it's a statement of status and, from your modern perspective, probably a masterclass in discomfort and impracticality, especially if you're not used to it, or if the weather isn't perfectly Roman sunny. For most people, the basic garment is the tunic, tunigia. This is a simple garment, usually made of wool. Yes, itchy, scratchy wool, especially if it's the cheaper kind, and formed from two rectangular pieces of cloth sewn together, with openings for the head and arms. It could be sleeveless or have short sleeves. It would typically reach to around the knees for men, and perhaps longer for women. It's belted at the waist, often with a simple cord or leather strap. Think of it as a very basic, shapeless sack dress. While practical in its simplicity, it's not exactly haute couture. And if you're used to soft cottons, breathable modern synthetics, or tailored fits, this woolen tube is going to feel agricultural. Now, if you were a male Roman citizen of a certain standing, particularly on formal occasions or when appearing in public in an official capacity, you might wear a toga over your tunic. This is the garment most famously associated with Rome, and let me tell you, the toga is an absolute beast of a garment. This is a mainstream historical fact. The toga was a large, semicircular piece of heavy woolen cloth, typically undyed, a creamy off-white, measuring perhaps 6 meters long and 2 to 3 meters wide. It was not sewn or pinned, but draped elaborately around the body, over the left shoulder and under the right arm. Getting it to hang correctly was an art form in itself, and wealthy Romans would have slaves specifically trained to help them don their togas. You, trying to wrestle with this unwieldy expanse of fabric on your own, would probably end up looking like a failed attempt at a Roman-themed Christmas tree. It's heavy. It's cumbersome. It restricts your movement, especially your right arm, which was often largely covered. And in hot weather, it's like wearing a personal sauna. Imagine trying to navigate a crowded Roman street or climb the stairs to your insula while managing several square meters of flapping wool. It's a recipe for tripping, snagging, and generally looking undignified. And keeping it clean? White wool in a dusty, dirty city? A nightmare. That's why fullers and their urine-based cleaning methods were in such high demand. Women typically wore a stola over their tunic if they were married Roman citizens. The stola was a long, sleeveless outer tunic, often pleated, that reached to the feet and was usually girdled beneath the breasts and or at the waist. Over this, when going outdoors, a woman might wear a palla, which was a large rectangular shawl, similar in concept to the toga, but less formally structured, draped over the shoulders and sometimes over the head. Again, mostly wool, though wealthier women might have access to linen or even imported silk, which was incredibly expensive. Footwear. Sandals, sandalia or soli, are the order of the day for indoor or casual wear. These are simple soles attached to the foot with leather straps. Good for ventilation, perhaps, but not much in the way of arch support or protection if you drop a heavy amphora on your toe. For outdoors, or for more rugged use, you might wear calcae, which were more like enclosed shoes, covering the whole foot and tying around the ankle. Soldiers wore sturdy hobnailed boots, called caligae. You, in your basic civilian sandals, will feel every single uneven cobblestone and stray pebble. Now for a quirky and slightly chilly tidbit about Roman attire. Trousers, brachii, were considered barbarian. Romans associated trousers with Gauls, Germans, and other northern peoples, whom they considered uncivilized. A proper Roman man would not be caught dead in trousers, at least not in Rome itself. Roman soldiers stationed in colder northern climates, like Britain or Germania, did eventually adopt trousers out of practical necessity, but it was a slow and somewhat reluctant acceptance. So, if you're feeling a bit chilly on a Roman winter morning, and yes, Rome does get cold, you can't just pull on a comfy pair of jeans or thermal leggings. You shiver in your tunic and toga and try to look stoic. The extent to which Romans in Italy might have discreetly worn some form of undertrousers or leggings in very cold weather beneath their tunics is a point of some scholarly debate, often relying on interpreting artistic depictions or rare textual mentions. But officially, bare legs were the Roman way. What about underwear? Romans did have a form of undergarment called a subligaculum, which was essentially a loincloth or a pair of simple shorts, worn by both men and women. It would be made of linen or wool, so you're not entirely commando under that tunic, thankfully. But it's a far cry from your comfortable modern underwear. Think less Calvin Klein and more rustic inconvenience. Color and decoration also signified status. While most everyday tunics were undyed or simply dyed with cheaper local colors, browns, yellows, dull reds, vibrant colors like true purple, purpura, were incredibly expensive and restricted, as we've mentioned, to the elite or the imperial family. Stripes, clavi on the tunic, as seen on the togas of senators and equites, also indicated rank. You, in your plain, probably rather drab tunic, are clearly marked as one of the masses. No peacocking for you. Imagine trying to function in this attire. The constant itch of wool, especially in the heat. The sheer awkwardness of the toga if you're unfortunate enough to have to wear one. The lack of pockets. Where do you put your keys? Your denarii? Your emergency snack? Answer: usually in a small pouch or purse, or tucked into the belt. And if it rains, wool gets incredibly heavy and smelly when wet. There are no waterproof Gore-Tex anoraks here. You just get damp and miserable. You might look with envy at the practical, comfortable, and versatile clothing of your own time. Jeans, t-shirts, trainers, warm fleeces, waterproof jackets. Roman clothing, while iconic, was a product of its time, its climate, and its social structures. For you, the unwilling time traveler, it's just another layer of discomfort and inconvenience in a day already full of them. You'd probably give half your meager Roman kingdom for a comfortable pair of sweatpants and a hoodie right about now. But no, you're stuck in itchy wool, possibly tripping over your own toga, and trying very hard not to look like a barbarian for wishing you had a nice, warm pair of trousers. Fashion, Roman style, is clearly not designed with your comfort in mind. The day, or rather, this incredibly long and challenging imaginary Roman day, is finally drawing to a close. You've navigated the rude awakening, the questionable breakfast, the chaotic streets, the hazardous housing, the rigid social structures, the backbreaking labor, the dicey lunch, the communal bathing, the brutal entertainment, the public potties, the frenetic markets, the terrifying doctors, the perilous night, and the itchy, impractical clothing. You are, to put it mildly, utterly exhausted. All you want is to lie down and sleep, to escape into oblivion for a few hours. But even this simple act, finding restful sleep in ancient Rome, is fraught with its own set of difficulties. You've retreated to your tiny, stuffy room in the insula. The single oil lamp, which you've carefully refilled with a bit of your newly purchased, and probably overpriced, oil, casts a feeble flickering glow. The sounds of the city, though perhaps slightly more muted than during the day, still filter in. A distant dog barking, the drunken singing of revelers making their way home, the creak and groan of the ancient building settling around you. Or perhaps, just perhaps, preparing for an unscheduled demolition. Your bed, as we established at the very beginning of this ordeal, is not a comfortable haven. It's likely a simple wooden frame with ropes or leather straps stretched across it, topped with a straw-filled mattress or pallet. Pillows, if you have them, are probably stuffed with more straw or perhaps rough wool. It's lumpy, it's scratchy, and it smells faintly of dust, mildew, and possibly the last occupant. You lie down, and your body aches from the unaccustomed labor, the endless walking, and the general stress of trying to survive in a hostile environment. Noise is a major issue. Those thin insula walls do little to block out the sounds from your neighbors. You can hear their coughing, their arguments, their more intimate activities. If someone in an adjoining apartment has a colicky baby, you'll be sharing in their nocturnal misery. Remember those heavy freight wagons we mentioned, rumbling through the streets at night? Their iron wheels on cobblestones can be incredibly loud, a thunderous interruption, just as you're drifting off. And then there are the animals. Stray dogs, cats, perhaps on the hunt for the rats that also share your building, and even the occasional rooster, crowing at an ungodly hour, convinced that 3 a.m. is the new dawn. This is a mainstream historical fact. Noise pollution was a significant problem in ancient Roman cities, frequently lamented by writers like Martial and Juvenal. who complained about the impossibility of getting a good night's sleep. Then there are the pests. Rats and mice are almost certainly cohabitants of your insula, scurrying in the walls and sometimes even across your floor. Bedbugs, fleas, and lice were also common companions in crowded ancient living conditions. You might find yourself scratching in your sleep or waking up with itchy red welts. The thought of what might be sharing your straw mattress with you is enough to keep anyone awake. Forget lavender-scented sleep spray. You'd be more in need of a can of industrial-strength bug killer, if such a thing existed. Fear is another unwelcome bedfellow. Fear of fire, always a terrifying possibility in these wooden tinderboxes. Fear of collapse. Will that ominous creaking from the floor above finally give way? Fear of intruders? Is that scratching at the door just the wind, or something more sinister? Your modern mind, accustomed to a greater degree of safety and security, finds it hard to switch off, to relax into vulnerability. Even the air quality in your room is probably not conducive to restful sleep. It's likely stuffy and close, especially if you've had to shut your wooden window shutters against the night air, and the night noises and the things that might fly or climb in. The smoke from your oil lamp, though providing light, also adds a layer of soot and fumes to the atmosphere. You might find yourself coughing, your eyes stinging. Scholars still debate the average sleep patterns and duration for ancient Romans. Did they get a solid 8 hours? Or was sleep more fragmented, perhaps with a siesta during the hottest part of the day, for those whose work allowed it, and shorter periods of sleep at night? Given the noise, the discomfort, and the general anxieties of life, it's plausible that truly deep, uninterrupted sleep was a luxury not afforded to many, particularly those in the poorer urban classes. And just when you think you might finally be drifting off, a new sound starts. A neighbor has decided it's the perfect time to practice their lyre playing. Badly. Or perhaps a heated argument erupts 2 floors below, complete with shouting and the smashing of pottery. You groan and pull your rough blanket over your head, but it does little to block out the relentless assault on your senses. A quirky, though perhaps not so amusing if you're living it, tidbit is that some Romans, particularly insomniacs or those seeking quiet for study, might actually try to work or read during the night when the city was relatively calmer. Pliny the Younger, for instance, often wrote about his nocturnal studies. For you, however, after the day you've had, the only thing you want to study is the inside of your eyelids. But Rome seems determined to deny you even that. You toss and turn, trying to find a comfortable position on your lumpy mattress. Every muscle aches. Your mind races, replaying the bizarre, stressful, and often terrifying events of the day. The smells, the sounds, the sights. It's all a bewildering jumble. You long for the peace and quiet of your own bed, in your own time. You yearn for a cool, dark, silent room, a soft mattress, and the blissful oblivion of deep sleep. But here, in ancient Rome, sleep is just another battle to be fought, another challenge to be endured. As you lie there, listening to the city's nocturnal symphony of suffering and survival, you come to a profound realization. You probably wouldn't last another day. Not really. The cumulative effect of the physical discomfort, the sensory overload, the constant low-level fear, and the sheer alienness of it all would be utterly draining. It gives you a new and perhaps more profound respect for the resilience, the toughness, and the sheer tenacity of the people who actually lived, worked, and slept in this incredible, terrible, magnificent, and maddening city. They were built of sterner stuff. You, on the other hand, are just about ready to trade your imaginary toga for a one-way ticket back to the 21st century, a hot shower, and a very, very long nap. The city eventually, reluctantly, begins to quieten just a fraction more as the deepest hours of the night take hold. The last of the drunken revelers have stumbled home. The argumentative neighbors have perhaps exhausted themselves into silence, and even the most determinedly off-key lyre player has finally given up. There's a stillness now, a heavy, expectant hush that settles over the dark rooftops and narrow alleys. Your own breathing seems to slow. Your eyelids feel heavy as lead weights. The sheer, overwhelming exhaustion of your long Roman day is finally beginning to claim you, pulling you down into a deeper state of weariness than you thought possible. The faint, flickering light of your oil lamp casts long, dancing shadows that seem to soften and blur at the edges. The sharp, specific anxieties of the day, the fear of falling masonry, the dread of dubious sausages, the social awkwardness of the communal latrine, begin to recede, replaced by a more general, pervasive tiredness. You can almost feel the city around you sighing, a collective exhalation of a million souls, each with their own struggles, their own small triumphs, their own fitful dreams. You nestle deeper into your lumpy straw pallet, which now, through the sheer power of fatigue, feels almost welcoming. The distant, occasional bark of a dog, or the soft rustle of wind through an unseen crevice in the wall, are no longer sharp intrusions, but rather a gentle, almost rhythmic backdrop to your descent into sleep. The rough wool of your blanket, once so irritating, now offers a strange sort of comfort, a simple, earthy reality. Let the worries of tomorrow, the renewed search for sustenance, the return to labor, the constant vigilance, wait for the dawn. For now there is only the profound need for rest, a surrender to the quiet darkness that enfolds you. Allow the final images of the bustling forum, the echoing baths, the shadowy streets, to fade softly, like watercolors dissolving in the rain. You are here, you are safe for this moment, and sleep, blessed and profound, is finally arriving.